Naval warfare strategy. You can see on the left the oldest recorded saltwater battle of the 12th dynasty in Egypt, 1100 BC. The Egyptians fighting against the Sea Peoples, an unknown seafaring peoples that emerged during the Bronze Age collapse, which was a large ecological disaster that de-urbanized most of the societies in the world. The Egyptians being one of the few societies who managed to weather the storm because of their strong state organization. These are four important naval battles that you should be aware of. Starting first on the top left, we have the Battle of Ichnomus in 256 BC. It was during the First Punic War between Rome and Carthage, and the Romans were maneuvering a fleet with their army on the south coast of Sicily when they encountered the Carthaginian force. In terms of the number of soldiers and sailors involved, a total of 290,000 deployed on 680 ships. It was the largest naval battle in human history. The next naval battle of importance is the Battle of Trafalgar in the top right. This was a clash between Lord Nelson, although the fleet was administered by Admiral Jervis. Nelson sought a decisive engagement against the Spanish-French fleet, and there was a significant amount of maneuvering before this fleet was engaged off the southwest coast of Spain. In fact, Lord Nelson had moved as far as the eastern Mediterranean and then across the Atlantic to the Caribbean, where he stayed only a few days and then crossed back with his fleet. At this battle, which was decisive and destroyed France's ability to attack the British Isles, compelled Napoleon to focus on an entirely land-based strategy. And so Napoleon, instead of building a fleet to invade England, instead moved his army opposite the Austrians, defeated them at Austerlitz in 1805, and then proceeded on to the invasion of Russia when his program to cut England off from trade with Europe failed. This Battle of Trafalgar involved 55,000 soldiers on 73 ships, and there were more guns at this naval battle than in any land battle during the Napoleonic conflict. The third battle on the bottom left is the Battle of Jutland, which took place in 1916, and it involved 250 ships. In terms of tonnage, it was the largest naval battle of its time. The German fleet was in its base at Kiel in Germany, and it would proceed out to provoke the English. And the English sent their fleet out, and there was a serious exchange of losses. The British lost twice as many ships in tonnage as the Germans, but then the German fleet went back to port and remained there for the entire war. So it's still a debate as to which fleet performed better strategically. The German fleet, which remained a fleet in being, or the British fleet, which effectively locked up the German fleet in Kiel. And finally, we have the battle on the bottom right, which is the U.S. landing at Leyte, which is an island in the Philippines, which was the largest battle of the Pacific Campaign, involving large numbers of aircraft carriers and big gun ships and aircraft. And it was the last major decisive battle sought by the Japanese to destroy the U.S. fleet, but it resulted in the destruction of the remainder of Japan's ships. When we're focusing on strategy, we're focusing on the use of naval power to achieve strategic goals that extend from the country out to sea. 70% of the Earth's surface is covered by water. 99% of the world's trade by volume and 84% by value travels by sea, mostly along predictable and established sea lines of communications, sea locks, which, if blocked, would halt trade. In the graphic, you can see the major choke points where naval movement can be halted by control of land, either by land forces or by coastal artillery in the form of cannon or patrol vessels or land-based rocket systems. You have the Panama Canal, the Strait of Magellan, and Tierra del Fuego in the south of South America and territories belonging to Chile and Argentina. You have Gibraltar, which is the narrow entrance to the Mediterranean from the Atlantic. There is the Suez Canal in Egypt, which links the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. The Bosphorus, which links the Aegean with the Black Sea through Turkish territory. There's the Bab el-Mandeb, which is the link between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. There's the Cape of Good Hope, which is on the southern tip of Africa, in South Africa. There's the Strait of Hormuz, which links the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea to the Indian Ocean. And there's the Strait of Malacca, which is a narrow strait between Malaysia and Sumatra in Indonesia, which links the Bay of Bengal in the Indian Ocean to the Pacific, effectively the South China Sea. This map shows the world's continents with population centers, and the thick lines and the dots at sea are individual ships, or the dense lines are aggregations of individual ships showing the scale of commerce, and the red circles indicate major ports. 95% of the world's trade by value travels through 9 strategic maritime choke points. These are them, and we saw these earlier. 43% of the world's traded oil passes through the Straits of Hormuz from the Persian Gulf into the Indian Ocean and then is redistributed. Choke points can be blocked by sea mines and anti-ship missiles. Here you can see a Soviet-era hovercraft. These are selected choke points with their depths in meters. And so some of these choke points, like the Panama, are very shallow, and because they have locks, because there are different levels of water, it's possible to deny the use of the Panama Canal by attacking it and destroying the locks. The Japanese considered this during the Second World War. The Strait of Malacca is only 18 meters deep, as is the Suez Canal. This is the cruise of the Emden, which was a Chinese-based German raider. In other words, it's a German ship designed to chase after and sink shipping of the enemy. But it was disguised as a freighter, so it's not easily seen. And these are its patrols through the sea lanes, destroying a large number of ships until it was eventually confronted and sunk. These are the straits in the South China Sea. The Strait of Malacca, the Sunda Strait, the Lombok Strait, the Makassar Strait. And these straits, if they were controlled, would deny the use of those straits for shipping. Here we can see the Arctic, particularly the sea lanes along the Russian coast, which are important for Russian oil exports. With the increasing temperature of planet Earth, the Arctic ice has been melting earlier and earlier every year, permitting the use of the Arctic for commerce. In fact, the movement of merchant ships from Asia through the Bering Strait between Russian Siberia and the Far East and Alaska would allow ships going over the North Pole to get to Europe more quickly. You can see 20 years ago which countries own how much shipping. This has since changed, and it's dynamic. It changes all the time. Typically, states with the youngest and therefore the least labor-expensive steel industry engage in the largest amount of shipbuilding. 50% of the world's population live within 200 kilometers of the oceans, and sea lift, moving goods by ship, is the cheapest form of transport, cheaper than railroads, roads, or flight. This is a graphic of the world's largest ports 20 years ago. Again, this changes. It depends on which countries at that time have a dynamic export market. And you can see in 2000 it wasn't China, but in 2020s it is. The picture is of the Soviet Kiev helicopter cruiser during the 1980s. So in terms of grand strategy, a navy is needed to control commerce. All great powers need and will seek to control the oceans to facilitate the movement of their merchant ships, which are a significant component of the economic health of the great powers. Historically, the hegemonic power, the largest single commercial power, usually had the most powerful navy by a significant margin, meaning by over 50%. That role is filled today by the U.S. Navy, which still has a significant margin of advantage because of its large number of aircraft carriers. This is a quote from Sergei Gorshkov, the admiral of the fleet of the Soviet Union, who's pictured here. History shows that those states which do not have naval forces at their disposal have not been able to hold the status of great power for very long. You can also see here the deployment of Soviet Marines. This is an estimate in 1995, which is now a quarter century ago, of the top navies ranked by combat power. So if you were to look at the extreme left column, you'll see the United States has 3,100 points of value. And then Russia was next at 580, and then Great Britain, and then Japan, and then France, and then China, and then Italy. For the military forces above Italy and below the US, there's been a significant reshuffling, with Russia having gone down the list along with Great Britain and France, and China having come up significantly on that list along with Japan. Here's a continuation of that list, and you can see the minor countries and their navies. Now, navies take a long time to build. If a navy is defeated, it can be catastrophic because it'll affect the state's commerce and power. States that lose their navies usually go into rapid decline. For example, the Dutch after the Anglo-Dutch Wars of the 17th century. This is why states are often so reluctant to make use of and risk the loss of their navies. This is a Soviet Kresta class ship. Now, whereas sailing vessels had unlimited power because they relied on the wind for their propulsion and thus could travel indefinitely, except for the needs of fresh water for their crews, modern ships have greater logistical constraints. Modern warships don't need to be refueled for 10 years if their reactors are designed for that purpose, but they need to receive aircraft fuel in the case of aircraft carriers, weapons replenishment in the case of other warships, and food, which limits the patrol time for nuclear submarines. So typically a subsurface deployment of ballistic missile submarines is for about 3 months. Thus, modern warships have much greater tactical flexibility. They move around 30 knots or 50 kilometers an hour rather than the 3 to 5 knots or 5 to 10 kilometers an hour of sailing ships, depending on the wind and the season, if they're going into the wind or not, and the different seasons have different wind directions. But modern warships have marginally less strategic mobility than sailing ships, which basically could go anywhere. Here you can see the explorers in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries who passed through the Pacific, largely with the use of sailing vessels. They could replenish on the shores. You can see also in 1521 when Magellan landed in the Philippines, thus claiming that territory for the Spanish Colonial Empire. Now, modern warships, unlike sailing vessels, which can replenish on coasts with fresh water and trade with local communities, modern warships are tied to potentially vulnerable coastal logistical bases, such as ports. The naval bases at ports, as well as other coastal targets of interest, are generally stronger than naval forces, because they're much harder to sink. Despite being fixed and easily detected, whereas naval ships are elusive and can hide in the vastness of the oceans, land bases can be, 1, hidden in the complicated geography of land, and 2, less vulnerable to being hit and sunk, and 3, less demanding on equipment. So, for example, land-based aircraft usually have better range than sea-based aircraft, in part because they're built less robustly and therefore more lightly. Operating deep sea or ocean fleets is also much more expensive than operating coastal fleets that don't have to be as self-sufficient or durable against storms. So the strategic use of naval power typically involves 3 roles of navies, and these come from James Cable, who's written a lot on the naval use of ships in diplomacy. Number 1, the military role, primarily deterrence. So here the focus is on sea command, which is what we're interested in here when we look at the military use of ships. 2, the constabulary role, coast guarding, anti-piracy, and focusing on non-state activities such as smuggling. 3rd, diplomatic role. This is gunboat diplomacy, basically prestige and swaggering. In other words, intimidating other countries with the potential of conflict to compel them to follow your own policies. This is the U.S. battleship Iowa in 1898, one of the ships that the U.S. built as a part of its White Fleet. Now, these are some of the key concepts that are important to know in naval strategy. First is command of the sea. This is the ability to use the sea in its entirety for one's own purpose at any time and to deny its use to the enemy. Sea control. Sea control is the condition that exists when one has the freedom of action to use an area of the sea for one's own purpose for a period of time and, if necessary, to deny its use to an opponent. Sea control includes the airspace above the surface and the water volume and seabed below it. Sea denial. Sea denial is the condition, short of full sea control, that exists when an opponent is prevented from using an area of sea for their purposes. Fleet in being. The fleet in being is the use of options provided by the continued existence of one's own fleet to constrain the enemy's options in the use of their fleet. There was a naval engagement where the French defeated the British in the English Channel, and the British fleet withdrew to port, and the French were not able to bring it to battle. The British Admiral Torrington argued this fleet was a fleet in being. In other words, he preserved the fleet, but he didn't want to use it. And as long as the fleet remained there in port, it would constrain the French, because the French could never move their merchant vessels or their amphibious vessels with troops around easily, because they'd have to protect these convoys against a possible sortie of the British fleet against them. Now, there's a big philosophic debate as to whether fleet in beings exist. It could be argued that after the Battle of Jutland, where the British fought the German fleet, and it was in some ways a tactical stalemate, the Germans inflicted twice as much damage on the English, but the English fleet was much larger, the Germans went to port. And the German fleet never re-emerged during the entire First World War. And the British argued that was a victory. The Germans argued it was a fleet in being. So it continues to be a debate. If you have a fleet in port but you can't use it, is it actually constraining the opponent? So the key thinker that we want to focus on, because he has the most compelling ideas about how to use naval craft, is U.S. Captain and Naval War College professor Alfred Thayer Mahan. He argued that command of the sea is the proper object of naval power, and this was to be gained by offensive action of a preponderating fleet seeking to achieve a concentration of force against the enemy fleet. He argued that states needed fleets in being, in other words, fleets that actually existed, because of the danger that states could be blocked from getting a fleet if they lost control of their oceans. Because if they lost control of their oceans, they could be attacked, and then their commerce blockaded and their ship production destroyed. This has occasionally been called Copenhagening. Essentially, the British were not pleased with the neutral fleet of Denmark that could have been deployed against British interests in the Baltic, so the British attacked the Danish fleet at Copenhagen and destroyed it. In this picture you can see the US Pacific Fleet operating against the Japanese off the coast of Okinawa during the Pacific Campaign of the Second World War. Now, because ports and land bases are stronger than ships, the enemy fleet must be lured out and destroyed in a great decisive battle. Because of the strength of the enemy ports, the enemy does not have to leave, but can be lured with an incentive, such as a threat against their commerce or coast, or threats against their cities, or the temptation of a weak threat or a weak opportunity. Mahan rejected the notion of blockades of the enemy's commerce, what the French call guerre de course, as time-consuming and therefore ineffective. Once the enemy's fleet was defeated, the coast of the enemy could easily be blockaded or attacked amphibiously. So the primary goal should never be to blockade an enemy. It should be to attack their fleet and then blockade after. Any time or any effort spent blockading an enemy fleet makes victory against the enemy's fleet less likely and therefore has a great cost. So this is the picture of the Battle of Jutland, which went for 2 days between May 31st and June 1st. There was no decisive outcome. The German and English fleets met, and then the German fleet was bottled up at Kiel until the end of the war. Essentially, the Germans went out. They had, prior to this, sent smaller groups of ships shelling the British coast. The Germans imagined that if they would be able to inflict a significant blow to the British fleet, then the British fleet would retreat to the ports and be less likely to come out to challenge the German fleet, and then the German fleet could interfere with the commerce of the British Empire. You can see in the chart on the top right the relative fleet strengths at the Battle of Jutland of the ships possessed by the Germans and the Brits, and how much of those ships were sunk during the battle. Now, Sir Julian Corbett and British Admiral Sir Herbert Richmond disagree with Mahan. Command of the sea was costly and unnecessary. Instead, fleets should focus on temporary sea control for the conduct of an operation, and this was sufficient. To blockade, to do an amphibious attack, to attack a convoy, all you needed was temporary control until the mission was complete, and then you could abandon sea control. The decisive battle and its pursuit was therefore unnecessary and risky and possibly very costly, especially if you lost. Both Corbett and Herbert argued that the Navy's key contribution is not the destruction of the enemy fleet, but assistance provided to land operations, because land operations are always more decisive in a theater of war. Many small battles were acceptable if they also contributed to sea control, and the extent of sea command was not absolute and could be measured by degrees. Consequently, blockades and commerce raiding by privateers or cruisers in a guerre de course and amphibious operations were essential contributors to winning a war on land. Here you can see a Soviet amphibious hovercraft. So let's take a look at some of the historical examples of naval competition. Here you see, after the Bronze Age collapse and the re-emergence of civilization in the Mediterranean, you can see the rapid emergence of colonies created by mercantile communities in Lebanon and among the Greeks. So the Phoenicians peopled the south coast of the Mediterranean as well as parts of the north coast, and particularly Iberia, and they pushed commerce significantly in those areas. The Greeks started their mercantile activity shortly after the Phoenicians, and they spread their knowledge and technology and culture mostly on the northern coast of the Mediterranean, but also significantly in Egypt. The alphabet that we use in Western culture today comes from the Romans, who adopted it from the Etruscans, who transformed the alphabet they learned from the Greeks, who in turn learned the alphabet from the Phoenicians of Byblos, and the Phoenicians of Byblos used the alphabet for the recording of taxes. These are the naval campaigns that were decisive between the Persian attack on the Greeks and the Greek resistance. The Persian army was estimated to be over 100,000 strong, and even though it marched south and managed to occupy Athens, it was heavily dependent on supplies from a fleet that was aggregated by the Persians from Egypt, Cilicia in Asia Minor, Cyprus, and the Levant, including Lebanon. This much larger fleet met the Greek fleet at the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC, and when the Persian fleet was decisively defeated, their military lost its supplies and became significantly weaker. And then a year later, the Greeks confronted and destroyed the Persian army, causing the army to withdraw. This is the situation 750 years later, with the central Mediterranean divided between the Italic peoples and the Romans of the Italian peninsula and the Carthaginians on the southern coast of the Mediterranean and Spain. There were 3 Punic Wars, which is what the Romans called the Carthaginians because of their Phoenician origin. Ultimately, the Romans were able to prevail primarily because of much larger demography. There were simply many more Romans than there were Carthaginians and allies. This is the battlefield of the Second Punic Wars between the Romans and Carthage. This is the war which involved Hannibal, one of the greatest captains of military history, who, with the Carthaginians and Celtic allies, moved into the Italian peninsula and inflicted some significant defeats on the Romans, including Trebia and Cannae. The key observation here is that the Carthaginians were the maritime state. They had the better fleet, they had the better sailors. The Romans sought equalization by creating a weapon called a corvus, which is basically a ramp with a nail at the end, and the Roman fleet would approach the Carthaginian ships, avoid being rammed, and would drop these ramps, and then Roman soldiers would run across and fight against the Carthaginian sailors and marines. And the Romans were generally the better land soldiers. This war, as occurred in the previous First Punic War, there were significant ocean storms which wiped out successive fleets. And so the loss of life was enormous in the naval campaigns of both the First and the Second Punic Wars, although Rome won all 3 of the Punic Wars. This shows the importance of the use of navies in the constabulary role, the police role, and in effect the Coast Guard and anti-smuggling and anti-piracy roles. This is a map of the Roman Empire showing its commerce and the sea routes where merchant vessels went. A big source of piracy for the Romans was in Illyricum, in what is today the Croatian and Slovenian coast in the Adriatic, and in Cilicia, which is in southwest Turkey. The control of the Mediterranean by the Roman fleet allowed stability. And so you had the emergence of insurance companies and transport companies that became very efficient. And so you had ships that were of several hundred tons carrying grain, not along coasts, but across the open ocean to what is today Tunisia, and all the way to Egypt and even to the Black Sea to import wheat and other starches into the major cities of the Roman Empire. Another fleet, which was populated mostly by the Belgae, or what is today Belgium, the Romans had a fleet along the English Channel to protect against piracy from Germans, which was very effective, and which patrolled along the Rhine River. With the fall of the Roman Empire, you had the emergence of piracy. And piracy emerged both from Islamic states on the southern coast of the Mediterranean and in the eastern Mediterranean, but also among the Vikings. The Vikings had a shallow-bottomed boat that could navigate rivers, but was also seaworthy enough and well-built enough to travel the open ocean. And the Vikings initially had a good knowledge of how to sail, because the tradition of shipbuilding along their coasts for fishing and transport between the different fjords of Norway and Denmark and communities on the coast of Sweden allowed the ships and the knowledge that the Vikings had to travel far. And ultimately, the Vikings were able to travel via Iceland to Greenland all the way to North America and to conduct raids deep into the Mediterranean. And generations later, the Vikings were able to even conquer parts of southern Italy and Sicily. But essentially, the Vikings began as a piratical movement with their first raid on Lindisfarne in what is today on the border of England and Scotland. With the end of the Reconquista, you had an explosion of expansionist energy from both Spain and Portugal, and a division of the world between those two powers by the papacy. And they burst upon the world with their caravels, very small but seaworthy ships. And it gave them an immediate advantage in establishing bases along the coast of Africa and the Pacific. And in particular, there was one Portuguese captain called Albuquerque who took 10 ships into the Indian Ocean, which was the major crossroads of global commerce between the Spice Islands of Indonesia, the goods exported by the Ming Dynasty in China, and goods exported, particularly cotton, from southern India. And the Portuguese under Albuquerque destroyed every non-European fleet. The Arab, Persian, Indian, and the influence of the Chinese fleets in Malacca. And that indicates the beginning of the European control of global commerce. It also facilitated the conquest of Mesoamerican civilizations like the Inca, the Aztecs, and the Maya. And it began the phase of European colonialism. These show the 17th, 18th, and 19th century colonial empires. This specifically is the Napoleonic Wars, the fight between the French and the English, showing their competing interests in North America, the Caribbean, South Asia, Australia, and the Mediterranean, as well as coastal parts of Africa. This is the British Empire at its height in 1909, when the British controlled 20% of the world's surface area and 23% of the world's population. And at the height of the British Empire in the 1870s, the British were the single largest naval power and had a flotilla in every ocean and sea on the planet. But as Germany rose after unification of Germany in 1871 and invested significantly in their naval power, the British abandoned their global presence and they concentrated their fleet in the Mediterranean and in Great Britain itself. And this is typical of what declining great powers do when they're challenging a new great power. The United States will very likely have to do the same thing with the rise of China. In other words, the US will have to pull out of the Mediterranean and focus its naval force in the Western Pacific. The US had an isolationist policy after the First World War with regard to Europe, but the US never had an isolationist policy with regard to the Pacific and East Asia. And after the Spanish-American War of 1898, where the US captured Cuba, Puerto Rico, they also captured Guam and the Philippines, and they aggressively seized other independent territories like Hawaii in 1898 as a means to establish bases across the Pacific and provide it a depth of security. So let's take a look at Japan and the Pacific War with the US as an examination, very, very cursorily, of the role of naval strategy in Japan's grand strategy. This here is the Battle of Tsuchima. Japan had taken an interest in ensuring that no great power controlled Korea, because the power that controlled Korea could use it as a base to invade Japan. So Japan became involved in politics in Korea. In 1895, it defeated China in a series of battles, including a naval engagement off the coast of Korea and off the coast of China, which destroyed the Chinese Beiyang fleet. And then 9 years later, in 1904-1905, Japan came to blows against Russia. So the Russians sent their fleet from the Baltic all the way around the world, through the Atlantic, through the Indian Ocean, through Southeast Asia, up to Tsuchima, which is an island between Korea and Japan. And there the Japanese surprised the fleet and destroyed it, causing the Russians to surrender, and then Japan got to dominate both Korea and Manchuria with the exclusion of the Russians. So this is the situation in 1931. The Japanese had control of Manchuria. In 1931, they began their expansion into northern parts of China. And then in 1937, they landed at Shanghai, invaded Peking, and started their invasion of China. In Europe, the emergence of the fascist regimes of Nazi Germany, Italy, and Spain made it very difficult for the English or the French to meaningfully interfere in Asia. And the United States was still isolationist and didn't want to get involved because of domestic sentiment. And so Japan was basically allowed a free hand to expand in China. But long-term US interest was to never allow a unification of the Eurasian landmass. In other words, the US did not want Japan to conquer China. Japan also had a large number of Pacific islands that you can see on the bottom right, which were mandated to Japan because it was an ally of the Allies during the First World War, and so it was able to seize those German islands, the Marianas, the Caroline Islands, and the Marshall Islands, and Palau, which were German possessions. So Japan sought to create the East Asia co-prosperity sphere, where Japan would seize control of China, make use of the wealthy coal reserves in Manchukuo, seize control of Southeast Asia from the Dutch, the French, and the English, and thereby make use of the rubber and the oil in Indonesia, and then use the islands in the Carolinas and the Marshalls as a barrier against the US Navy that would come and interfere with this Japanese commerce. So the dark band is the main sea line of communication between the resources of Southeast Asia, and the shaded areas in the north are the source of coal from Manchuria and Korea that also fed the Japanese industrial system. And so the Japanese goal was to strike at the American fleet, as it had with the Russian fleet in 1904-1905, and then hide behind the shaded area, the Marshalls and the Gilbert and the Caroline Islands, which would play the role of an attrition against the U.S. fleet. The white arrows indicate areas that the Japanese raided and that the Japanese subsequently captured after their attack on Pearl Harbor. So the Japanese took over Southeast Asia, including Vietnam, occupied Thailand and Burma. They conducted raids against the British fleet in southern India, and they moved into the Coral Sea on their way to isolate Australia from the United States. Now, there was an attack in Europe in which the British used carrier-based aircraft called Swordfish, using torpedoes. They conducted a raid on the Italian fleet, which is based at Taranto, which is an Italian port in Apulia in southern Italy. And you can see the reconnaissance photograph showing the British attack on the battleships, and it was very successful. And while it wasn't a major source of inspiration to the Japanese, technically it gave them an idea that what was a possibility in terms of a Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor could indeed be accomplished with a good payoff. These are the Japanese preparing for the attack on Pearl Harbor with a large mock-up of the Pearl Harbor naval base and the location of the major warships. Now, it was thought for a long time that most of the spies helping the Japanese were ethnic Japanese in Hawaii, because at the time in 1898 when the U.S. seized Hawaii, the Japanese outnumbered American citizens on the island. However, the main source of intelligence for the Japanese Navy was actually a European, non-American. So this is the overall map. The blue line indicates the advance of the Japanese fleet from the Kuril Islands, because the Japanese needed to secure a surprise. And so they advanced on Pearl Harbor. They conducted their attack there, and then they returned home. And on the way, they seized control of Wake Island. This is the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7th, 1941. 6 Japanese carriers attacked, and they sank and seriously damaged 8 American battleships and 8 other ships, and destroyed 200 aircraft on the ground. And this permitted the rapid expansion of the Japanese fleet and army and marines throughout the rest of Asia without interference from the U.S. Navy. Here is the precise attack in the harbor itself against the U.S. ships lined up. These are the U.S. ships burning in Pearl Harbor. And so this graphic shows the expansion of the Japanese. They captured the area that's outlined in yellow. So they moved into Southeast Asia, including Indonesia and as far as Burma. And they also advanced into the Pacific, moving down the Solomons to the Gilbert Islands and capturing Attu and Kiska, which were 2 islands in the American Aleutian chain as a part of Alaska. This also shows the Battle of Midway. This map shows the rapid Japanese advance after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the quick conquest of Indonesia and all of its oil, the 4-month battle that ultimately defeated the U.S. in the Philippines. The Americans surrendered at Corregidor, which is a fortified island off the coast of Bataan near Manila, and the Japanese campaign against the British in Malaysia, which ended up with the defeat of the British at Singapore and the surrender of Singapore on February 15th, 1942. In almost all cases, the Japanese were very successful, even though they didn't outnumber the Americans or the British, because they had air cover and ships, where the Americans and British did not. There was also here the Battle of the Java Sea on the February 24th, in which a Japanese fleet destroyed a collection of British, Australian, and American ships, desperately trying to resist while outnumbered. In May of 1942, the Japanese decided to take over the Solomon Islands to cut off the American link to Australia, which the Australians thought would delay the war effort. And these are fascinating battles because you had four major carrier actions which were fairly evenly rated between the US and the Japanese, and neither side won any decisive defeats. On May 1942, the Japanese used carriers to advance to New Guinea in the Coral Sea. The Japanese lost their carrier Shoho, and the US lost their carrier Lexington. US codebreakers had warned of the Japanese arrival, and it was first of a great many naval battles. At the same time as the naval battles were occurring, the US Marines and the Japanese Marines were fighting desperately on the island of Guadalcanal, which you can see to the middle right of the map. And both sides had no supplies and no air cover and were subject to occasional shelling by large gun ships. So it was a very, very difficult fight. The key is that the Americans were able to hang on despite a lack of experience, which demonstrated their quick ability to learn. This is the U.S. aircraft carrier Yorktown. This is the Japanese attack on the U.S. carrier Yorktown. Now, this was the journalistic interpretation of the threat Japan posed to the U.S., where the Japanese would seize Pearl Harbor and then move on and land Japanese Marines off the coast of California. This is absurd. Japan had 1/7 of the economy of the United States, and the U.S. was fighting less than optimally because most of their critical naval resources, particularly destroyers, were deployed in the Atlantic fighting German submarines. So Japan should really be thought of as a minor power or a middle power fighting against, at that time, the largest industrial power in the world. This was the journalistic interpretation of what Germany could do if it won the war in Europe and defeated the Soviet Union and England and then built up a large German fleet. They would basically take the Vichy colonies in Africa, use it as a springboard to land in South America, where there was some antipathy to the U.S., and then somehow invade the U.S. Through the Caribbean with support of fifth columnist German Americans. So on June 1942, the Japanese conducted an attack on Midway. This was a luring campaign. The Japanese didn't really need Midway. It was an island that was very small, but it was in the direction of Pearl Harbor, and it would have permitted them to have a garrison and maybe some patrol aircraft to see where the U.S. fleet was going. But its purpose was to trick the American fleet to come out before it was strong enough so that the Japanese could destroy the American fleet and then buy time and conquer more of Asia, so that when America did build up its fleet, the Japanese could then negotiate from a point of strength. But that's not what happened. The Americans broke the code, knew the Japanese were coming, and 3 American aircraft carriers took on 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. There were another 2 Japanese aircraft carriers that were in violation of the concentration of force, were sent to the Aleutian Islands. But the Japanese thought that if they were to attack the Aleutian Islands with an aircraft carrier, because it's sacred territory to the U.S. would have to defend it. But the American valuation of Alaska was very different than the Japanese valuation of the Japanese islands, and so the Americans largely ignored the attack on the Aleutians. In effect, what happened was the Americans gambled better than the Japanese. The Japanese made tactical errors, but there's nothing profoundly wrong with the Japanese luring of the American fleet at Midway. But it was bad luck. The Americans lost 1 aircraft carrier, the Yorktown, and the Japanese lost all 4 of their aircraft carriers. And in fact, 1 U.S. pilot, a man called McCluskey, sank 2 Japanese aircraft carriers as a dive bomber in just a matter of a few minutes. Probably in history, you've never had one individual having so much of an impact on the decisive battle. The impact of Midway is, because it sank all 4 of the largest carriers in the Japanese fleet, after the Battle of Midway, which was only 6 months after the attack at Pearl Harbor, Japan began to lose. And this indicates just how much of a gamble their naval operations were. Beware of seeking a decisive battle. It has huge payoffs, but it's also highly risky. This is the actual Battle of Midway itself. The way you interpret it is you follow the lines and you look at the date along the lines, and you can see the sunk aircraft carriers along the way. The Kaga, the Soryu, the Akagi, and the Hiryu. Here you can see a destroyed Japanese cruiser, a US SBD Devastator bomber, and a US destroyer. There followed the battles in Guadalcanal in 1942, Henderson Airfield on Guadalcanal, which you can see in the Solomons. If you look at the very bottom of the map, the large blue arrows, Guadalcanal is an island in that area. Japan unsuccessfully tried to wear down the U.S. fleet in the Solomons and isolate the American fleet, but with the passage of time after the Battle of Midway, the Americans were able to hop island to island through the Solomons, up through New Guinea over the years, isolating 100,000 Japanese at the base on Rabaul in New Britain, just north of New Guinea, and then worked their way to the Philippines, and then worked their way to Okinawa 4 years later. In effect, the Americans were also island hopping with the Navy, starting with the Gilberts. And you can see that with the blue arrow in the middle right of the map. And there the Americans didn't capture every island. They captured the key islands that gave them air bases that allowed them to isolate Japanese garrisons on the islands and to just keep moving forward. And that line of invasion ultimately culminated in Iwo Jima. That took 4 years. The journalistic plan was for the American fleet to go from San Diego to Pearl Harbor and go immediately to Japan. But this was impossible. The large American fleet, though modern, was dependent on logistics and had a significant loss of power, a very sharp loss of strength gradient, and so they needed a large supply train to be battle worthy. And so they actually didn't have a lot of range. So the conquest of the Japanese islands and the approach to Japan itself took a very long time. The Japanese were defeated in May of 1942 at the Battle of Midway, and they waited 2 years before attempting to stop the U.S. fleet again. And that was in June of 1944 at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese deployed aircraft carriers with significant number of aircraft, but by this time in the war, the Japanese pilots had been attrited down, and the U.S. pilots were better and had significantly larger numbers of aircraft, and this resulted in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. In effect, on June 20th, the Japanese aircraft carrier Hiyo was sunk, and the American submarines sank the Japanese carriers Shokaku and Taiho. This battle left Japan's maritime carrier force destroyed. This battle was mainly an error because Japan did not concentrate the rest of its force. And the net consequence was that it weakened itself if it wanted to conduct any subsequent decisive battles. The net result of this defeat was that the Americans were able to take Iwo Jima, and from Iwo Jima they were able to bomb Japan much more easily with the large B-29 strategic bombers. So this led to Japan's last great attempt to achieve a decisive battle against the U.S. fleet. The Japanese deployed most of their remaining carrier force and of their big gun battleships, including the Musashi, the largest battleship ever built. The American intention was to land on Leyte, which is a small island you can see on the middle right of the map, and they were escorted by innumerable support carriers and big gun battleships. The Japanese had a couple of good maneuvers. They were able to distract a part of the U.S. fleet. They were able to attack the supporting fleet that was supporting the American Marines and soldiers landing on Leyte. But for the most part, The American big gun ships destroyed the Japanese at the Battle of the San Bernardino Strait and the Battle of Surigao Strait, sinking the Musashi and destroying a great many of Japan's ships. At the conclusion of this battle, there was simply no Japanese fleet left, and Japanese defeat was inevitable, despite desperate Japanese attempts to use the kamikaze to attrit down the American fleet. This is a picture of the U.S. fleet conducting landings at Leyte. The fleet was enormous. This is a simplified map showing the territory that Japan captured at its greatest extent, not including some territory that it captured late in the war in China. Now here I want to tell you another war that was being fought. The U.S. built 288 submarines during the Second World War, of which 37 were sunk and 23 were lost to other accidents. The Japanese had 75 submarines, but were building them very slowly. Japan depended on imports for 20% of its food and 20% of its coal, 88% of its iron ore, and 90% of its oil. And these came by ship mostly from Manchuria in China or from Southeast Asia. Japan did not convoy ships effectively, did not have particularly good anti-submarine warfare techniques, doctrines, technologies, and therefore suffered heavily. By the end of the war, only 231 out of 2,337 Japanese merchant ships survived. The U.S. sank 91% of Japan's merchant fleet. Only 55 of 190 Japanese submarines survived the war. Now, the Japanese used their submarines not to attack American commerce, which was difficult because American commerce was actually very far away, and the Americans had no vital commercial transactions in the Pacific. The Americans got their oil from their own resources in Texas, or they got it from Mexico. So the Japanese used their submarines purely in the naval support role to identify American flotillas and target them with attack of their main fleet. So Japan lost the economic war much more terribly than it lost the naval combat. After the Americans conquered Iwo Jima and the Philippines, they moved on into Okinawa, and then they were preparing to invade the Japanese island of Kyushu in the home islands. And at that point, a Soviet invasion and destruction in 6 weeks of a very large Japanese army in Manchuria, and the dropping of 2 atomic bombs in August on Hiroshima and Nagasaki led the Japanese to surrender. During the Cold War, the Soviet naval strategy, if a Third World War had broken out, was to block the U.S.'s ability to intervene to help its allies while the Soviets completed land invasions of both Western Europe, the Dardanelles involving Turkey, the Middle East up to the Persian Gulf, and the Chinese frontier area, and possibly parts of Hokkaido in Japan. The Soviets established naval bases from which they could operate small fleets. So the Soviets were confident they would be able to protect the Barents Sea in the Arctic. They would be able to disrupt commerce and the ease movement of U.S. Allied fleets in the Mediterranean, the Arabian Sea, off the coast of Vietnam, and in the Northwest Pacific. One of the decisive areas would have been the GI-UK gap, which is the sea territory between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK. The Soviets would have moved about 300 of their submarines through the GI-UK gap, which was defended by listening devices, the SOSUS system, ships equipped with anti-submarine warfare supported by aircraft and helicopters and satellites, and the 300 submarines would have position themselves in the Atlantic to fight yet another Battle of the Atlantic to block North American resupply of European allies in NATO defending against the Soviet advance. And you compare this to the 60 submarines that China has today, and you can appreciate the scale of the Soviet threat. This presentation continues as a talk given on the impact of Mahan versus Corbett on a likely war with China and the US. It's entitled Mahan and the Strategic Causes of the Outbreak of the Next Pacific War. And you should treat it as a possible case study of the theories that you've covered so far. The link is posted here on the slide, but is also available in your notes, and it can be found on YouTube. The data set for the lecture is posted in the remaining slides in PowerPoint, which follow this slide. So this is the peer fleet campaign cases. And what is meant by peer is powers fighting other powers that are of equal stature. So the Anglo-French War of 1213 to 1214, the English and the French were approximately the same in terms of their power. And it indicates which country was the victor, which battle was the decisive battle of the naval campaign, and that battle must have had a luring component, meaning one of the fleets had to lure out the other fleet to fight that battle, because one of the two fleets was weaker and therefore was in port, but the temptation or the lost opportunity of not going out was too great, and so they met in battle. And then the decisive effect of that battle, did it contribute to the end of the war? And if it did, it confirms the evidence from Mahan. If it didn't, if the war was resolved through actions by ships other than the result of the naval battle, such as a blockade or an amphibious landing, then Corbett is demonstrated to be correct. So these are the campaigns at sea between the 14th and the 15th century. These are the peer campaigns between the 16th and the 18th century in the case of the Ottoman-Habsburg Wars. These are the campaigns of the 16th and 17th century. These are the campaigns of the 16th and 17th century. These are the campaigns of the 17th and 18th century. These are the campaigns of the 18th century. These are the campaigns of the 18th and 19th century. These are the campaigns of the 20th century. And this is the last campaign of the 20th century, the Falklands War of 1982. This file is campaigns between non-peer fleets. In other words, a great power and a lesser power. And included here is the US campaign against Japan during the Second World War, because Japan was significantly weaker than the US.